Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be discussing emotional intelligence and empathy. My name is Patrick Allen and I'm the Program Manager for Kent State's Center for Corporate and Professional Development's Public Open Enrollment Programs. Our center specializes in providing employee development for partnering organizations in Northeast Ohio and around the country. We offer training as public open enrollment programs delivered in Independence, Ohio, and also on-site customized programs delivered at your location. I am joined today by Kent State facilitator Alberto Arroyo. I will be serving as your host, and Alberto will be our presenter for today. For over 15 years, Alberto has facilitated leaders across various sectors, including higher education, retail, parishes, consultative services, and healthcare. He has partnered with a wide variety of organizations to advance the development of their leaders, including university hospitals, Southern Adventist University, General Electric, and Hewlett-Packard. Alberto believes that the best workplace outcomes occur when science and art, logic and intuition, and mind and heart are proportionally applied. He is certified in and uses a multitude of assessments to help him tailor leadership solutions to address the challenges and problems of each organization. Alberto received a Master's of Arts in Industrial and Organizational Psychology and also an MBA from Elmhurst College. Everyone in attendance today has been muted to avoid background noise from any of the over 300 registered participants. We do encourage you to ask questions at any point during the hour. You can submit your questions in writing using the control panel on the right side of your screen. I will present your questions to the presenter as time permits throughout the webinar. There is a handout available to you that summarizes today's presentation. It is located under the Handouts tab on the control panel. We encourage you to download it and take notes during today's presentation. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording after we conclude our time together. Before we begin, I would like to start by asking a question of you, the audience. How important is empathy in the workplace? Not important, somewhat important, very important, or essential? I will give you about a minute to answer this question, and then we will show the response. Okay, it looks like the majority of you have voted, and it looks like the overwhelming majority says that empathy in the workplace is either very important or essential. So now that the results of the poll are in, I would like to turn it over to our presenter for today, Alberto Arroyo.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you this morning, and thank you, Patrick, for that introduction. It's always a bit odd to hear a description about yourself, and all that Patrick shared is true. So I can validate that. And as I think about this morning's conversation on empathy and emotional intelligence, I was thinking about how to specifically frame the next hour for you, because sometimes it could be a bit confusing to think about empathy and think about emotional intelligence and separate them. So the way that I would like to frame it is by providing sort of two guiding principles. The first one is, what is empathy's impact on emotional intelligence? And the second, as a result of the first, is that we will spend the majority of our time focusing on empathy and how it can increase an individual's emotional intelligence. And number two, allow the leader then, or the person then, to become a more effective leader. So in some ways, we're focusing more on the empathy part and how it impacts the emotional intelligence part. And I'm very happy to see that the majority of responses do validate empathy as an important part of being effective in the workplace as a leader. Oftentimes it's a combination of hard skills versus soft skills that allow an individual to be most effective, but it's the emotional softer skills that tend to have the greatest differentiating impact between good versus great leadership. So let's kind of dive in, and you see the agenda in front of you. We'll spend a bit time up front just to frame an emotional intelligence model, and then we'll get into empathy and the foundations of it, and then begin to make some connections between empathy and its impact on emotional intelligence. And then we'll wrap it up with some takeaways and some questions. So if I would ask you the question, what matters most in leadership? And then I would ask you to list the characteristics of the best leader that you have ever experienced or ever learned from, versus the characteristics of the worst leader that you have ever experienced. What type of things would you write down? I've asked this question many times, and what I've typically seen is that the majority of responses relate toward emotional intelligence, softer skills and abilities within an individual. So I would hear selfless for the strong leader. I would hear selfish for the worst leader. And you can see the pairing, all of which have some type of connection to emotional intelligence. On occasion, I will hear things such as certification, experience, technical skills, knowledge, etc. But the majority of the time, what differentiates between top level leadership versus average to below average leadership is associated and connected with emotional intelligence, which makes our conversation today so much more meaningful because it could be a differentiator in your career, especially when you consider how the workplace is changing and the degree of network, the degree of collaboration, the degree and the speed of information sharing that requires there to be a constant sensitivity and awareness of how interactions are really happening. But the good news, I think, for all of us is that emotional intelligence is not a static competency. It's one that can be grown, is one that can be developed. And I think one way to develop that is through focusing in on empathy and the application of that particular aspect. And that's what we'll spend our time focusing on. So in terms of a framework for emotional intelligence, I think there are multiple frameworks that you will probably run into, and many of them have these dimensions or these components demonstrated in different ways. But nevertheless, the foundation is typically there. And let me describe it this way. So if you look at the top left quadrant where it says self, there is a personal side to emotional intelligence that is displayed and demonstrated with self-awareness and then applied with self-management overall. Right next to emotional intelligence also has an others component. So it's not only an aspect of recognizing thoughts, feelings, emotions in self, but there's also an others component of the recognition of such in others, which then ultimately impacts the interaction and the relationship. If you look on the left-hand side and you see awareness for both the self as well as the others aspect, there's a need to be reflective and to be thoughtful. And then lastly, the action both for what do you do with how you're feeling, how you're thinking, and how that impacts the ultimate relationship. And ultimately, an effectiveness in emotional intelligence allows for a positive impact in overall work performance. So that's the framework in which we want to begin the discussion about exactly what empathy is and how its improvement and application could help an individual be most effective at work. So let me kind of explain a little bit about what empathy is. Empathy was first, let's say, described by a psychologist named Edward Titcher. And it was back in 1909 when he first coined the word empathy. And it came from the Greek word empatheia, which is to enter the feelings from the outside or to be with a person's feelings, passions, or suffering. And when you think about the components of what empathy looks and feels like, I will give you three of them as a guiding principle to kind of give a general definition of empathy. The first one is taking the perspective of another person. This can be described as listening, giving proper verbal, nonverbal feedback that you're tracking with the individual's thoughts and ideas and feelings. A second aspect of empathy, and perhaps the most difficult one for us to exhibit, is a level of restrainment, of criticism or judgment, where empathy is not trying to fix or advise or change or necessarily redirect or guide. It simply is about being in the moment with the individual, which requires a restrainment of any type of judgment. And then the third component of empathy is the ability to be able to recognize accurately what the other person is feeling. And we'll learn here with a few pictures how cross-cultural the ability for us to empathize really is. But let's start with this question. Are we born with the capacity to have empathy? I think there could be a lot of conversation, perhaps even a lot of debate. But I think that the majority of the evidence and the research clearly says that the answer to this question is yes. Everyone is born with a capacity to give and show empathy, and also to want to receive empathy, which is one piece of evidence of why the capacity to give empathy is innate in us. The difference is in degree, in perhaps comfort or ease in providing empathy. So if you would look at a scale 1 to 10, everyone is at least at a 1, but there are individuals who are closer to a 10 and those who remain closer to a 1. So it could be looked at as a competency that needs to be practiced, applied, in order for it to be developed overall. And to give a bit of an experiential moment of do I have the ability to empathize? Does everyone have the ability to empathize? I'm going to show you a few pictures, and you're going to see these faces. And the question is, what emotion is this person expressing? So here's the first picture. What emotion am I expressing? Take 5 seconds to write it down for yourself. And what I wrote down is 2 words, thrill and or excitement. So associated words with thrill and excitement, I think, are indicators that we were on the same page in interpreting this particular picture. The second picture, what am I expressing? What I wrote down for this picture is sadness or depression or melancholy. If you wrote or thought of a similar word, then we were applying empathy and interpreting empathy pretty similarly. The third picture, what am I expressing? I wrote shocked, stunned, or surprised. And I would imagine that you wrote something or thought something very similar to that. What about this picture? What emotion am I expressing? I wrote down agony or pain. And then lastly, what emotion am I expressing? Similar to the first one, where I wrote down thrill and excitement, I think it could be interpreted in this way. But if you wrote down joy or happiness, then that could be a distinction of emotion, first of all, and second of all, perhaps a bit more accurate. So I did an ad hoc pseudo experiment this week with these pictures as I was preparing for our time this morning. And I'll just give you an example of 3 individuals. One is a 5-year-old non-English speaking young girl. Another is a 38-year-old male. And the last is a 12-year-old female. And I showed them these pictures and I asked them to provide their description. And the 5-year-old was right on the mark with 3 of the 5 in comparison to what I wrote down. The 38-year-old was spot on, 5 versus 5. And the 12-year-old was 4 out of 5 versus what I wrote. Even if they would have just gotten 1, it would have demonstrated some level of capacity to properly interpret the emotion, which is evidence of our general capacity for empathy. And I think it will transcend culture. I think the ability to empathize transcends nationality, social class, age, because of its innate application. And the reason that this is important is because in our workplace today, we have all types of backgrounds, we have all types of perspectives and experiences that are being brought into the workplace. So if you are a tribe chief from Japan that comes to the USA, and you see a young child or you see a coworker express or give an expression of some emotion, you should have the capacity to be able to interpret that. More so, the need for each of us to be understood by others is so basic to who we are that it is an essential aspect of every person across all cultures. So if you're a leader in an organization, your ability to empathize is a differentiator and a necessity for motivating, for influencing, for redirecting, for providing feedback, for coaching individuals on your team or that you work with. So let's look at baby and empathy and compare it to leadership and empathy. And let's look at the environment of a child created by the parents, and let's look at the environment of a leader created by the leader. So from the neuroscience perspective, and I'm not a neuroscientist, however, I do want to make this connection. Every single activity that a child does impacts their growth and their maturity. So if a child is, splashing water, if a child is hearing song, if a child is playing with a toy, all of that is creating connections in the brain that are impacting their eventual capacities to demonstrate all types of behaviors, competencies, and activities. And oftentimes, because a baby cannot verbally communicate over time, it is not in words that they are growing and maturing, but it is in the daily interactions that they see, that they hear, that they feel, and that they experience. And the safety and the security that is developed by a child is directly linked with the safety and security provided by the parent or the context that they live in. So things don't necessarily change as we get older. Our brain is still active. Our brain is still creating new pathways, eliminating some and creating new. And we're not just creating it based on what we hear or what we're told, but all aspects of the environment that, let's say in this case, that the leader is creating. So therefore, a leader's ability to be effective in the workplace has a lot to do with the context and environment that they're creating, which is directly linked to their capacity to demonstrate empathy, to demonstrate understanding in two ways. For self, what do I want? What do I need? And more importantly, for others. Because empathy is something that we desire to receive. So one reason that this topic is so important is that if a leader's job is to create the right environment, the right context for effectiveness to be produced, there needs to be a level of competency with empathy overall. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about what the foundations are of empathy. So similar to the framework of EQ, I think we could provide a similar framework for empathy. There's a awareness part, there's a social part, and there's an application part overall. So let's start with the foundation of empathy, which is self-awareness, which kind of correlates with the foundation of emotional intelligence. And let me ask you this rhetorical question. Do you take time to self-reflect and think? And I would venture to conclude that our ability to read others' minds, to empathize with others, depends on our initial capacity and ability to know and reflect on our own thoughts, on our own feelings overall. So to the extent that I know myself, then I might be able to then understand others. And in our fast-paced world, this happens to be one of the most difficult things to really do, is to take time throughout the day in order to ask yourself questions such as, how do I feel? What am I feeling right now? How can I change my mood, change my thoughts, change my emotions? In order to increase your capacity for empathy, which then directly impacts your capacity to apply emotional intelligence, we must spend significant time reflecting on and thinking about what we're feeling and experiencing. So simply put, self-awareness means having a deep understanding of one's emotions and broadening that out to relate to our strengths, our limitations, our values, our motives in the moment. And when we spend limited time considering the self-awareness piece, we really debilitate ourselves from improving or applying effective empathy and therefore effective emotional intelligence. So when you go to a training session, a trainer oftentimes incorporates breaks in between, some short, some extended, and I think we should apply that ourselves as we think about ways to grow our capacities in empathy. So keeping with the framework, let's look at self-management, and let's describe this as the control center of an individual. So if you take the string from self-awareness to self-management, self-management is what comes out based on what you're thinking and what you're feeling. The greater ability for us to properly understand ourselves in the context in which we're in, the more able we're able to behave and act in an appropriate type of way. So look at self-management as your control center is not just having good self-awareness of what you're thinking and feeling, but then what you do with it. And it could be described as an inner dialogue, an inner conversation that moderates your eventual actions and behaviors. Then we get to the social awareness and the empathy piece. And I think this is where perhaps our biggest challenge is and lies, especially the higher an individual goes in the hierarchy and the matrix of an organization. And this is why. If we cannot see the other person as human, similar to us, we will not therefore be as capable to identify with that person and therefore demonstrate empathy. If we cannot put ourselves in that place, in that person's shoes, we would not recognize his or her experience in order to properly respond to it. And the failure of being empathetic is really devastating at different levels. If it's apathy, that's pretty bad because there's not caring and therefore isolating or avoiding. Or even worse, it leads to cruelty and violence if an individual is unable to put themselves in the shoes of their audience. And where this is most dangerous is the higher an individual goes in the organization and the more detached they are from other people that are contributing to the overall success, the more potential for adverse impact, which is one reason that you guys might be familiar with the show Undercover Boss, why that show had such a resonant feel and was so popular for the time being, and why it was transformational not really for the employees that the CEO and senior leader necessarily were interacting with, but the senior leader themselves. It was a great way for the individual to apply what we're talking about here. The social awareness and the capacity to provide empathy was demonstrated by experientially connecting with the other individual's world overall. And it's not necessarily hard for us to demonstrate empathy. We do it all of the time. So when you see someone wince, or you see someone kind of cringe, you know that they're in pain. How can you behave in such a way that recognizes that you understand their perspective? So think about that employee that comes to you with fear, with uncertainty, because they don't know what to do with an employee. They don't know how to go about a project. Rather than jump into problem solving, a good way to create safety, create comfort, is to emotionally connect first by just sitting with the individual, by just probing and perhaps seeking to understand more their fears, which could make an individual more effective when problem solving or generating ideas with the individual. So use your ability to pick up on cues to impact your response and your behavior. And if you're able to lead with empathy, that will be a benefit for you. Let's talk about the last component here of the model, the relationship management piece and the empathy piece. And if there's a word that I want to associate with empathy, is the word connection. So how do you go deeper in relationship with an individual? Empathy, I think, provides the biggest pathway and the smoothest road in order to connect. And just like physically improving a muscle, the way to practically improve empathy is to engage with individuals and seek to understand self and others throughout the interaction. So if you're isolating yourself, if you are more of a high-level leader that directs through, let's say, email or quick notes, perhaps you're not giving yourself the options and the opportunity to really improve your capacity to demonstrate empathy that impacts the relationship directly.
Okay, Alberto, at this time I do want to launch our next poll question. And the question is, how able are you to demonstrate empathy? Not able, somewhat able, or very able? Again, I'll give you about a minute to answer. Okay, it looks like, again, majority of you voted, and about 98%, 99% of you said somewhat or very able. So that's good. Also had a question come in. And it says, Alberto, it says, I agree and believe that everyone has the capacity for empathy, some more than others. But when is it appropriate to act on the empathy you feel, especially in the workplace?
That's a great question. And what I would venture to say is that empathy is something that would always benefit the relationship in the long run. However, the differentiator of driving accountability, perhaps giving tough and difficult feedback, might be a differentiator of when you might take the empathy and sort of set it back a little bit and be a bit more direct, a bit more directional, a bit more instructive. And I think that would be the biggest guideline to provide with empathy, is that empathy has very little to do with solving problems or making, giving an idea or a suggestion. I recently heard a video, and the presenter said that the introductory line of "at least something" is never an empathetic perspective. And we try to do that all of the time. So think about a colleague that has lost a job. And you might respond trying to be encouraging, trying to be positive. You might respond and say, well, at least you have experience, or at least you have degrees, and at least you have the capacity to get another job. That is getting outside of the realm of empathy and getting into the realm of action and solution. Empathy is more about sitting with the emotion and sitting with the feeling. And I would describe as one differentiator when there needs to be given perhaps a sense of urgency or accountability, where empathy might take a back seat. But hopefully, based on your history of demonstrating empathy, the audience and individual is able to interpret your directness in a caring and positive way, even though it will not necessarily be described as being empathetic. So I want to highlight something about the poll because it's just one question, and I'm very encouraged to see the perspective that many of you have, that you can and that you're able to demonstrate empathy. I think that really is a strong beginning. I think that the gap really is between capacity and execution. And sometimes proper empathy takes a couple of iterations. And we initially respond empathetically, perhaps in the way that we want to be responded to or to be taken care of, which may or may not be the most appropriate way to respond to somebody else. So therefore, as you're thinking about the application of empathy, consider that there's a bit of a trial and error until you get to connecting and meeting the needs of the individual depending on where they're specifically at. So don't think that you failed or that you're not good if your first try, if your first response is not properly interpreted or received by the individual. Continue to sort of press toward desiring to further understand and further connect with the individual. So let's get to two key summary questions and then get a bit practical with ways in which to improve empathy. Number one, I think we answered the question, can greater empathy be built to grow emotional intelligence? The answer is yes. Greater empathy can be built, and it can also remain as well. But for it to remain, we must continue to practice it. We must continue to apply it. And how then can I grow my empathy? Before I address this, let me highlight this. If there are individuals out there who are trainers or leaders who spend time developing the skills of others, most of our training tends to help our neocortex, which is where we gather data, logic, and surface ideas in order to be able to apply it. Very few of our training environments really address the limbic system, which is where emotions and empathy are found. So we have to be careful when we're coaching or when we're training that we keep the practice of or the insights to empathy at the neocortex level, that we provide definition, that we provide examples and all types of stories, and then we get an individual thinking about the mechanics of empathy and not so much experiencing empathy. So as we think about how to specifically train for empathy, we have to think about how do we get beyond data, logic, and surface ideas and into experience and practice that is live. So therefore, consider any training in the world of empathy as it relates to emotional intelligence to be about depth and experience within the person in the class. I would use a lot of one-on-one interactions. I would try to get individuals to really think and consider when they have received empathy in the workplace, what it has done to them, because the more that, as we go back to the model, the more they could become aware of their feelings and their emotions and their need for others to understand them, the greater capacity they have to then apply empathy to another person. I'll make another connection that just came to my mind. I have built dozens of competency models for organizations. And I build competency models and then I build assessments in order to evaluate the effectiveness of the application of those competencies. One of the most important competencies in the workplace is influencing and or motivating, which are distinct but equally important. And it typically is the lowest scoring at all levels, entry-level leadership as well as high-level leadership. So therefore, this whole empathy thing that applies to influencing, empathy that applies to motivating is very, very difficult. But one key indicator of people who are strong in influencing and who are strong in motivating are those individuals who have the capacity to deeply reflect and understand their particular emotions and feelings and be willing to change their perspective, be willing to admit they're wrong, be able to admit their mistakes. If you're a good influencer, if you're a good motivator, as you gather data, your perspective starts to change, where you begin to maybe agree with another perspective or you agree with the other side. I want to apply the same concept to empathy. Empathy takes time and it takes work, and the more you're able to recognize that you're missing the point, you're not getting deep enough, the better capacity you'll have to properly apply empathy. So be willing to change, be willing to adapt. Your perspective will increase, I think, your capacity to empathize. And here are three principles, three ways in which to work on empathy, which impacts the EQ. First is intentional effort, a conscious, on purpose of what you're thinking, of what you're feeling, and what others are thinking and feeling as well. For self, it's about self-reflection and pausing. And for others, it's about asking questions. Open-ended, probing, seeking to understand at a deeper level type of questions, and being open and willing to change your perspective based on the new pieces of information that you're receiving. Number two is a motivation to practice. It's perhaps an elusive type of goal that you're attaining to get deeper into understanding self, getting deeper into understanding others, especially in the workplace where interactions oftentimes are really quick and don't lend itself to a lot of depth. But consider sitting down and writing particular goals and objectives that will motivate you to consistently practice empathy. Just like a muscle, the more you practice it, the more capacity you will have in this space. And this would include saying and doing things that are outside of your comfort zone. So perhaps when you see the facial expressions that we saw, that you courageously follow up with that and seek to understand for accuracy, for the individual to share more. And then lastly, it requires an emotional commitment. And some of us are more comfortable with the emotional side than others. So wherever your starting point is, know that your next step will require a level of investment from an emotional type of level. Okay. And then lastly here, let me provide you 6 ways to improve empathy and positively impact emotional intelligence. And these are things that you can do by yourself and on your own. Number 1, book reading. Read a book and learn a new perspective. The more you read, the more you open your mind and start to experience things that you would not otherwise in your location. Okay. Number 2, join a book club, some social club, where you're sharing the reading experience and beginning to see things differently. And the book club is just one example. It could be any type of social club that requires a sharing of thoughts and ideas. Number 3, role making and imagination. Watch a movie or play or put yourself in another person's shoes as much and often as you can. Next time you watch a movie, put yourself in one of the cast members' perspective and see how you resonate and connect with that. 4th, road taking. Be someone else for a day at work. Job sharing happens quite a bit in the workplace. How can you do that more? Taking stretch assignments that put you interacting and engaging with other people in other groups, other departments, could be beneficial to increase empathy and positively impact EQ. Creating art, expressing yourself through writing or through drawing or even coloring, allows your brain to be active, to have new pathways, new connections that are developing. And then lastly, performing, act in a play or a musical, play charades, be fun, be outside of your comfort zone. All of these things begins to help your ability and capacity to see and feel things in different types of ways. And I will not necessarily go through these. You can read them on the screen. You might have your own takeaways, but these are 3 for you perhaps to highlight in our time. And I think there's a lot of great resources that apply to the application of empathy in the workplace, which positively impacts emotional intelligence. In your handout, you will see 5 book recommendations on the topic of empathy. You might read some of these, for example, Emotional Contagion by Hatfield, and say, this is too therapeutic. I would encourage you to persevere through the learning and recognize that what you could learn from the therapeutic psychological world applies greatly and immensely in the quote-unquote real world, the quote-unquote workplace overall. So allow yourself to sort of muscle through some of these books, one of these books, and really try to understand empathy for empathy's sake. And then you begin to draw the bridge to how it applies to your environment in the workplace specifically. So some general thoughts and insights for you to continue to work on your ability to apply empathy at work.
Okay, we do have some questions that came in. We have a few minutes here. First question, how do you handle an employee or employees that require more attention than the others? I do not want to label them as needy, but they always seem to have an emotional need. It always takes a great deal of time, and I feel as I'm being unfair to the other employees.
It's a great question, and the practicality of it is really, really important. So here's what I would say. The need for emotional support will vary from individuals. What I think is key for you as a leader is to seek to have them understand that you care for them. So even if you can't spend extra time, so much additional time carrying the emotional weight or dealing with the emotional aspect of an individual, how you could communicate to the person verbally and non-verbally that you care, so that ultimately you can equip them to be more self-sufficient. One of the aspects that I really like about coaching that I differentiate between therapy is the fact that in a therapeutic relationships, oftentimes the client becomes dependent on the therapist. In a coaching relationship, which we often have in the workplace, that should never be the case. The goal of coaching is to increase the independence, the self-sufficiency of the individual. So from an empathy standpoint, seek to ensure that the other person knows that you care, but your main job is to try to equip them to be self-sufficient, and that's what coaching is about, and which differentiates it between the therapeutic application of empathy. Let's call it.
Okay, next question. How can one ask for empathy? For example, if you are not the leader, but you are seeking empathy, do you need to empathize in order to receive empathy?
That's a great question. I think verbally sharing openly and vulnerably in the workplace is the easiest pathway to receive empathy. I think sometimes in the workplace we carry around these masks, we carry around these facades that we want to show and demonstrate to the world. But in reality, we have insecurities, we have vulnerabilities, and the more we're able to show them, the more likely we're able to receive empathy, which makes the connection to the importance and value of culture, the importance of value of leadership at all levels of the organization, beginning with the top and infiltrating it through the entire organization. So therefore, consider the importance of environment so that an individual can be more comfortable to be vulnerable with their thoughts, feelings, and emotions.
Okay, thank you, Alberto. Unfortunately, that does conclude our time together. If you would like to learn more about today's topic, we encourage you to contact us about bringing this program on site to your location. We are able to tailor all of our programs to fit your needs. You can contact us at 330-672-3416 or at your training partner at kent.edu. I also encourage you to visit our website to see our upcoming open enrollment programs that are delivered at the Educational Service Center of Northeast Ohio in Independence. You can see the registration link on your screen. I do encourage you to register for programs soon, as these programs routinely fill. You can join our extensive list of clients and bring Kent State to your organization. We also encourage you to register for our next webinar, when we will be discussing professional presence with Kent State facilitator Christine Zust. During this webinar, we will define professional presence, discuss a mantra that will shift your mindset as a professional, and the professional code of ethics. For those attending live, you will be asked to complete a short survey. Please complete this survey so that we can be assured that we are bringing you the most usable and relevant content possible. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Kent State Center for Corporate and Professional Development and our facilitator, Alberto Arroyo, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.